Hello, welcome. Today we're going to discuss two learning theories that have to do with instructional design, how courses are developed, how they're created. It's important to understand how learners process things so that we can better help them reach a point of understanding. The first theory is the cognitive load theory. Pass and Sweller discuss 5 main principles. The first of which is the information store principle. This states that our long-term memory has the capacity to store a lot of information. The second principle is the borrowing and reorganizing principle. As humans, we have the ability to watch, to observe, to imitate those around us. And that's how we borrow and we reorganize this new information with what we already know. And that has to do, an example of that might be like on-the-job training, and that's why it can be very effective. The third principle is randomness as genesis. What that means is that when we encounter something totally new without any direction or any kind of instruction, that we will puzzle on it, we will problem solve, we will go through trial and error and try to figure out something about this information or process. Our fourth principle is the narrow limits of change principle. And what that states is that we have a limited capacity to work with new information, to try to process it, to try to understand it. And so Pass and Sweller state that we can store, or we can work with, 7 bits of information, plus or minus 1 or 2, as we're all different, and for a length of time of about 20 seconds at a time. And the last principle is the environmental organizing and linking principle. And what this states is that those limits for working memory don't apply to long-term memory. When we have understood something and stored it in long-term memory, we don't have limitations to how we can work with it because it's a known, it's an understood. And we also relate that information, and it is organized, and it's in a contextual schema that it's stored. So those are the 5 principles of the cognitive load theory. Pass and Sweller also discuss the cognitive architecture, that when we get a new piece of information, something that we are trying to understand, that we have to work with it in our working memory. And we can only do a little bit at a time and for short periods of time. And little bits of that starts being stored in our long-term memory. And the more we work with it, the more we interact with it, the more we try to study it, the more bits and pieces of it we're storing in long-term memory. And when we reach the point that we can talk about this new information, that we can demonstrate this new skill, that we can do it all in our working memory, that means that there is no limit. That narrow limit of change principle is not applied. That information is now understood. It's in long-term memory. That's the cognitive architecture of the cognitive load theory. Lastly, Pass and Sweller discuss 3 types of cognitive load. The first is intrinsic. Intrinsic cognitive load deals with the complexity of what you're trying to learn. If something is complex and difficult and it takes a lot of working memory to try to process, it has a high intrinsic cognitive load. Extraneous cognitive load refers to if there are flaws in the design of the learning, that basically if a learner has to spend time trying to figure out what's asked of them, the instructions are unclear, the chart doesn't make sense. Okay, I've got this big Excel spreadsheet, where do I begin? What do these numbers mean? Where do they come from? All of these kind of questioning and uncertainties and trying to problem solve what's expected and what the information is coming from or what they're supposed to do with it leads to a high extraneous cognitive load. And that's not a good thing. It's taking away from the processing of the information. So our germane cognitive load is trying to find that balance of the two. We want to have a high intrinsic cognitive load where we're dealing with the new information, what we're trying to understand, and a lower extraneous cognitive load. We don't want things taking away. We don't want the methodologies or the way it's presented to take time away from our learners' ability to process this new information. So those are the types of cognitive load. Now the other theory we're going to talk about is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Mayer states 3 assumptions, the first of which is the dual channel assumption. He states that there are 2 channels by which we process information. The first is auditory or verbal. The second is our visual or pictorial. And that we learn best when presented information that's connected, that's relevant to each other, that supports each other through both of these modalities. The second assumption is the limited capacity assumption. Again, stating that we can only process so much new information at one time, about 5 to 7 chunks of information. The third assumption is the active processing assumption. The learner has to be engaged with this new subject matter, with this new knowledge, with this new process, with this new skill. The more that the learner is involved, the more active, the more they're going to be able to process it, and they'll be able to transfer that information to a point of understanding. There are 5 cognitive processes involved. The first 2 have to do with the learner selecting either relevant words or images and making connections with that. The third and fourth cognitive processes are the organizing of these selected words and images, giving them some kind of structure, some kind of organization so that you can make comparisons or generalizations or do something with that information and with other things you know. And then the 5th process of this point is that the integrating of the word-based and the picture-based representations. That this takes a lot of brain power, or if you want to say a lot of your working memory to process this, because you're trying to connect these pictures and these words together, and you're organizing it and making a structure in it and trying to connect it with prior knowledges, and that's the point where understanding will come into play. So these 2 theories, cognitive load theory and cognitive theory of multimedia learning, have similarities and differences. They both are concerned with a working memory and a long-term memory. There's a limited capacity of that working memory. There's a hindrance to an overloaded memory. Meaning construction is created through processing. And that there's a necessity for learners to be active and involved in their learning. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning also has this sensory memory component and also expands upon the cognitive load theory. So what does this mean to us as designers? Well, there's a lot more details we can get into, but let's just stick with a couple of key points that we can all do today. One is keep it simple. We don't want to bog down the learner with anything that's unnecessary. Make sure that when it's written or text or slides, that the key points are only on the slides, like beyond bullet point design. We want to make sure that any visual elements that we have are relevant and that they support the main points. They're just not cool to have or a neat effect. We want to make sure that our verbal and text and activities are all integrated so that our different channels are being processed. The lessons should be short, focused, and to the point, because our goal is to help the learner understand. We want to help them store this new information in their long-term memory. Thank you for joining me today.